This was the office of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. MacDonald. Within these walls unfolded scandals and political patronage, deal-making and drama. And from here was launched the national dream of a transcontinental railway.
All aboard!
In the 1860s, much of British North America was embroiled in controversy. It was a particularly trying time for the man who would soon become Prime Minister of the new country, Canada. John A. MacDonald, then aged 46, was convinced that his political career was over. But in fact, it had scarcely begun. It was the dawn of the Canadian Confederation, and the railway was a contentious issue in the British North American colonies. In public assemblies, the subject came up time and time again.
Promised these promises and more we have fulfilled.
Tell us about the railroad. Well, tell us, John A.
Aye, you're gonna build more railroads, Johnny?
No, yes, more railroads.
Give away the people's money?
A railroad from New Brunswick to Detroit.
Another much debated subject in 1861 was Confederation itself. The idea was to unite Upper and Lower Canada with the Maritimes. John A. MacDonald believed the way to achieve this goal was to first unite the regions by rail. His vision went even further. He dreamed of linking the entire continent from coast to coast.
Iron trunk swindle. Tell us about that.
Yeah, tell us how you milked the public purse.
Oh, now, gentlemen. Tell how you milked the country for $25 million for a useless railroad.
It's in the Globe. The Grand Trunk Swindle.
I court the Globe that would break up the railroad and divide the country and say it was all in the national good.
Yeah. What about the ships rotting in Kingston Harbor and Coburg because of your railroad?
And nothing to show for it but debt.
What we have to show, sir, are great works that will endure to our children's children. For every pound, so much railroad, so much canal.
Tell us how you sold yourself to the Lower Canadians.
The Grand Trunk Railway was Canada's first major rail network. Although it was a private company, it received generous government grants. Indeed, taxpayers had contributed no less than $25 million to the railway. Its main link from Montreal to Toronto was inaugurated with great pomp in 1856. If MacDonald wanted what many called a pipe dream ever to become reality, he would have to find solid support. It is estimated that by the mid-19th century, more than $100 million in foreign capital had been invested in Canada's railways. A large part of that sum went directly into the pockets of entrepreneurs and promoters, who were rewarded partly for their work, but mostly for their political connections.
Exactly. But with old friends around me, I feel compensated. I have something to say about William Weller, the stagecoach mogul.
Oh, John.
When the railroads were closing out his business, his bread and butter, he said, "I am rejoiced to see old things passing away and conditions becoming weller." Imagine if it were to become possible, what a purpose that would give to our lives. The riches of both our oceans, the forests of our east and west joined with our vast prairies.
It took 6 years of negotiations and the promise of a railway linking them to the provinces of Canada before Nova Scotia and New Brunswick finally agreed to join Confederation. On July 1st, 1867, the first Dominion Day was celebrated.
Well, gentlemen, they have been tiring labors. but I hope worthwhile. I have now to propose that the best interests and future prosperity of British North America will be promoted by a federal union under the crown of Great Britain.
The task that now awaited Sir John A. MacDonald was daunting. To fulfill the terms of Confederation, he had to build a railway line to the Maritimes. Construction got underway with the help of a loan from the British government. The new line would be called the Intercolonial.
But the expense.
And I say we'll use standard gauge, standard steel rails and iron bridges on the Intercolonial.
Nonsense.
We're not just building a railroad, gentlemen. We are building a country.
Patriotic rubbish.
Well, we can just stop that. I had a push. Come on, Owens. And Roberts.
9 years later, the Intercolonial was finally completed. But the focus had already shifted to the West. Could it be persuaded to join Confederation too? The western regions were then owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1868, the Bay surrendered ownership of these lands to the Canadian government for $1.5 million. 3 years later, Sir John A. MacDonald managed to convince British Columbia to enter the Confederation. He made a promise. Within 10 years, a railway would link the province to the rest of the Dominion of Canada.
And there were two companies that came forward to offer to build this railroad. The one was known as the Canada Pacific Railway Company, which is different than the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, which is a later company. And that one was situated in Montreal. And the man who was the leader, or the head of it, the president of it, was Hugh Allen, who was the president of the Merchant Bank and who was a wealthy entrepreneur. Most of the source of money for his company came from American sources. The other company was located in Toronto, and it was headed by a man by the name of Senator David McPherson. And most of the money for that company came from British sources.
Hugh Allen was the richest man in the land. This illustrious ship owner represented the very image of the Canadian capitalist. His personal fortune was believed to total the astonishing sum of more than $6 million, an unheard of amount of money back then. Hugh Allen was a versatile entrepreneur whose companies were flourishing in Canada. To his list of business endeavors, why not add the construction of a railway? Just before the 1872 federal elections, Hugh Allen gave $350,000 in campaign funds to the Conservative Party. In return, he was promised the contract to build the Transcontinental. The Conservative Party was returned to power by a slim margin. MacDonald could now focus on the task of building his railway. As promised, he awarded the contract to Hugh Allen's Canada Pacific Railway Company. But the pact became public knowledge. The Conservatives were accused of corruption. The newspapers published correspondence between Hugh Allen and Georges-Étienne Cartier, MacDonald's ally in Quebec, that proved the secret deal exchanging campaign funds for the building contract. The news spread like wildfire. In 1873, the scandal was on everyone's lips. Donald Smith, who had been a member of Parliament since 1871, publicly expressed his lack of confidence in Prime Minister MacDonald. It was a decisive moment in what became known as the Pacific Scandal. The building contract was canceled.
The Liberals become aware of this bribe. It becomes public knowledge. It's debated in the House of Commons, and the Conservatives are forced to resign.
MacDonald's reputation was tarnished by the scandal. It was a cruel blow for a man who had already experienced more than his share of misfortune. After his marriage to Susan Agnes Bernard in 1867, he was overjoyed by the birth of a daughter. But the child was born physically and mentally handicapped, and Sir John A. soon fell into a state of depression. January 1874, Liberal Alexander Mackenzie became Canada's second Prime Minister. During his mandate, the Transcontinental Railway advanced barely a few kilometers. Construction was not a priority. The entire world was facing an economic crisis. But MacDonald fought back. 2 years later, he scored points with the launch of his national policy. He believed industrialization would pull the country out of its economic slump. He proposed raising customs duties, encouraging immigration, and the key to the national policy, completing the railway. Voters regained confidence in MacDonald, and he won the 1878 elections.
Feed the railway! Our railway or separation. The terms and nothing but the terms.
MacDonald's first task was to appease British Columbia, which still did not have its railway link to the rest of the country. It was threatening to separate. MacDonald contracted an American entrepreneur to begin dynamiting the Rockies in preparation for the railway. An invitation to tender went out for the construction of the railway. The only Canadian company to bid was the Canadian Pacific Railway. The main players in the syndicate were 4 Montrealers, all of Scottish origin. George Stephen, president of the Bank of Montreal. His cousin, Donald Smith. R.B. Angus, and Duncan McIntyre. This was the origin of the now legendary railway, whose history is so interwoven with that of Canada.
$25 million as an outright subsidy. They gave them 25 million acres of land. They turned over to this new company all of the track which had already been built, the section that the Liberals had built during their period, which was approximately 700 miles. They promised them that there would be no taxes for 20 years on the land, the 25 million acres of land that they were given for homesteading purposes, and that for perpetuity they would be paying no taxes on their stations and actual company lands. And finally, there was also the promise of a monopoly clause, that no competing line would be built south of the CPR line to compete with it. So these were incredibly generous terms to encourage the company to build.
Although the Liberal opposition complained of MacDonald's generosity, the contract was ratified in 1881. It was an enormous undertaking, much more costly than expected. The $25 million sum initially allocated was exhausted long before the completion of the railway. On several occasions, the Canadian Pacific Railway nearly went bankrupt. Somehow or another, the railway would be built, and built it was. It took 4.5 years. On November 7th, 1885, Donald Smith drove the last spike in the Transcontinental Railway. It was John A. MacDonald's dream. It was the national dream. It had cost a fortune, but it had also made many a fortune. These nouveau riche financiers were known as the railway barons. Between 1860 and the start of World War I, Montreal emerged as Canada's metropolis. The city had everything: port facilities and factories, financial resources and railway barons. It quickly became the hub of export activity for products from the West, which was one of the foundations of Canada's economy. Because Canada was part of the British Empire, Montreal maintained close links with Great Britain. Not surprisingly, many of Montreal's businessmen were loyal English subjects, but the most influential among them were, in fact, of Scottish origin.
Montreal was the site of the Industrial Revolution in Canada. The Lachine Canal, the railways, the major bridges, the large companies, they were all founded here with capital from England and Scotland. The people who lived in this area were the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, the great industrialists. It was these same people who shaped Canada's economy. Without exaggerating Montreal's contribution, we must acknowledge that this was where the country was founded in terms of finance.
Many of the wealthy industrialists and entrepreneurs lived in the central neighborhood known as the Golden Square Mile. It was there that the fur magnates had built their estates in the early 19th century. Great fortunes were made in the era of iron and steam, and Montreal became home to some of the richest men in Canada. They built luxurious residences that testify to their owners' wealth. This superb mansion, reminiscent of a Scottish castle, is the home of Donald Smith. As remarkable as the exterior is, it pales in comparison to the sumptuous interior. The railway barons did not just accumulate wealth, they were in many cases great art collectors. Donald Smith's collection, like that of several other directors of the Canadian Pacific Railway, became one of the first in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Indeed, the museum itself was born of their generosity. Not far from Donald Smith, at the foot of Mount Royal, lived George Stephen. Indeed, around 1900, some 70% of all the wealth in Canada was concentrated among the residents of this Golden Square Mile. Built in 1882, George Stephen's mansion was the pinnacle of lavishness and opulence. This magnificent greenhouse, bathed in the ambiance of never-ending summer, evokes the atmosphere that reigned in the homes of these great Victorians. Without a doubt, the most extraordinary feature of George Stephen's house is this staircase. Built of Cuban mahogany, a wood that is now protected, its value is today estimated at over $20 million. In 1925, this mansion, located on Drummond Street in Montreal, became a private club, the Mount Stephen Club.
This is a residence we could call a semi-detached, to use a rather banal term. It's made up of twinned houses built in 1894. There were many other houses under construction at around the same time. You have to imagine the whole neighborhood being built up at that time. There were many large residences. This one housed the Angus family and the McIntyre family. The two families were quite linked. Both were of Scottish origin, once again. They had family ties, but also they were both connected to the Canadian Pacific Railway. You've heard of the Angus shops. Well, the Angus family had a pied-à-terre here in the semi-detached, and they also had a large mansion in Senneville near Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue. They all had links with the railway. In fact, if we look at Peel Street between Dr. Penfield and Pine Avenue, we can find many elements of the history of rail in Canada in these few meters.
Another remarkable residence in the Golden Square Mile was the McIntyre's private mansion. Built on Drummond Street in the 1880s, it was unfortunately demolished 50 years later. Inspired by the architecture of the great Scottish manors, it is easy to imagine this stately home shrouded in fog in the beautiful Scottish countryside. In 1947, McIntyre's descendants donated the land to McGill University. But these were not the only majestic buildings in which Duncan McIntyre invested his huge fortune in the late 19th century. One of the most remarkable estates that he had built is today the home of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. This historic building on René Lévesque Boulevard was also comprised of two semi-detached homes. On the west side, Thomas Shaughnessy, successor to George Stephen, president of the CPR, luxuriated in the cultivated atmosphere of this splendid home. The east side was occupied by none other than William Cornelius Van Horn. Like his colleagues at Canadian Pacific, Van Horn was an enthusiastic art collector. His home was like a museum, with Japanese porcelain and paintings by the great European masters gracing the walls. His collections were the subject of prestigious exhibitions. Van Horn himself indulged in painting and demonstrated a certain talent. One of Van Horn's key collaborators during the construction of the Transcontinental Railway was his right-hand man, engineer James Ross. Not surprisingly, he too decided to establish residency among Montreal's elite in the Golden Square Mile.
James Ross
was the engineer in charge of railway construction in the West for many years. He came to Montreal and had a house built for himself by the American architect Bruce Price. Bruce Price was well known in Montreal, in Quebec, and Canada for several reasons. It was he who had designed Windsor Station, and it was he who had designed the original Chateau Frontenac. And that brings us to Canadian Pacific's grand vision, with architects who successfully left their mark on the urban landscape. Ross's mansion is interesting because it became the very heart of high society life in Montreal. The city's elite would meet here in the house for receptions and in the garden too. We forget that these grand houses were not only works of built architecture, but also works of landscape architecture. The trees that are found in the garden now, the building now houses the law faculty, are a collection of trees. There was an interest in horticulture, an appreciation of exotic plants. As a result, we have been able to preserve certain places and elements of the landscape.
Across the street from his own home, James Ross had a house built for his son, John Kenneth. In comparison with the preceding mansions, this one is quite sober, but times change and so do architectural styles. The younger generation's lifestyle was different too. Charles Hosmer, president of the Ogilvy Flour Mills, was also director of Canadian Pacific's Telegraph Department. He was the type of entrepreneur best described as a self-made man. In 1901, Hosmer hired Edward Maxwell, one of the most reputable architects in the country, to design his private residence. The Hosmer House was purchased by McGill University in 1969. There was one other resident of the Golden Square Mile whom we cannot fail to mention, Sir Hugh Allen. Not only was this accomplished entrepreneur the richest man in Canada, but up until then, no man in the country's history had managed to acquire such a fortune. Hugh Allen wanted everyone to know it. The name of Sir Hugh Allen's house, taken from that of a Scottish castle, was Ravens Crag, where ravens nest. And it was quite a nest, with no less than 70 rooms. This vast mansion was built in 1863 at the top of McTavish Street. Now the wealthy ship owner could literally look down upon the whole city.
Sir Hugh
Allen was quite an interesting character. He was born in Scotland and came here as an immigrant. He learned his trade, he had a good foundation, and he quickly moved up the ladder. Eventually, he became the dominant figure in finance in Canada. His house was built in the 1860s, in the early 1860s, which was a little before the heyday of the square mile. but it remains one of the symbols of this area. We see how it has taken over the mountain, how it looks down over the city. Why is the house located here? Partly to get away from the smog of downtown, but also because Hugh Allen wanted to see his ships arriving in the port from the tower in the middle of the building. It is said that at the time there was not a government in Quebec or in Canada that had not dined in Allen's house. That indicates the close links that were developed. If you think about all the issues concerning the railway, the development of canals, trade with the West, etc., Canada was also a business undertaking, so it's not surprising that business people were intimately linked.
After the death of Sir Hugh Allen in 1882, his son and daughter-in-law, Sir Montague and Marguerite, inherited the lavish mansion. It was Hugh Allen's extensive fleet of ships that allowed him to live in such luxury. In 1910, Canadian Pacific acquired 19 of these ships. Sir Montague, feeling a little cramped, decided to enlarge the family home. He redecorated the interior in an even more pompous style. The house was kept up by an army of live-in servants. Also on the 12-acre property was one of Montreal's finest stables. Sir Montague, who was president of the Jockey Club, prided himself on having only thoroughbreds in his stable. Sir Montague Allen owned a second house, a humble abode in the village of Cacouna. During the hottest months of the year, the Allens liked to escape the stifling heat of the city and enjoy the fresh country air. After the death of Sir Montague, Lady Allen donated Ravenscrag to the Royal Victoria Hospital. In 1943, the mansion, renamed the Allen Memorial, was transformed into a psychiatric hospital and research institute. Just across the street was the residence of Henry Vincent Meredith, husband of Sir Hugh Allen's niece. Within the exclusive perimeter of the Golden Square Mile lived a kind of microcosmic society.
It was a small community, a village in a sense. The magnificent houses that we see here, the ones that were not demolished, were also private schools, because on the upper floors, the governesses and private tutors educated the children. It was a tight circle, and over time they created their own institutions. The families were linked by marriage, and further links were created by the proximity of their homes. This is the house of Sir Hugh Allen's niece, but his own house was just across the street. It was built in the 1860s, this one in 1894. This one was a gift from the uncle to his niece. Her husband was one of the directors of the Bank of Montreal. The Bank of Montreal itself was a very important milieu, so there were family ties, business ties. It was a society of its own.
Sir Vincent Meredith died in 1929, but his wife continued to live in the house until 1941. She donated it to the Royal Victoria Hospital, and in 1975, it was acquired by McGill University. Almost all the buildings in the area around McGill University and its many institutions owe their existence to the elite of the Golden Square Mile. In 1894, Donald Smith and George Stephen each gave $500,000 to the city of Montreal to build the splendid Royal Victoria Hospital. Its architecture, reminiscent of a European castle, testifies to the distinctive style that Canadian Pacific embraced in its cross-Canada network of luxury hotels. Donald Smith was one of McGill University's most generous benefactors. The Royal Victoria College was built at his behest in 1899. At the time, the college for young girls had around 50 students in residence. They were nicknamed the Donaldas in reference to their benefactor's first name. When the building was inaugurated in 1899, it received a prestigious gift, a statue of Queen Victoria. The sculpture was the work of Princess Louise, none other than Louise Caroline Alberta, daughter of Queen Victoria. Princess Louise, who gave her name to the province of Alberta, was married to the Marquis de Lorne, then Governor-General of Canada. The monumental statue still stands watch over the Sherbrooke Street entrance to the college, which is now the Strathcona Music Building. Behind the walls of the sumptuous mansions that made up the Golden Square Mile lived some of the richest families in Canada. In 1881, from this privileged environment emerged one of the great railway companies, Canadian Pacific. Across the ocean in Scotland, beginning in the mid-19th century, ambitious young men were choosing to leave behind the green pastures, misty valleys, and idyllic castles of their youth. These wealthy aristocrats emigrated from the old country to build a new bourgeoisie in North America. In their hearts and minds, they carried the landscapes and traditions of their beloved Scotland. These Scots, some of whom became the great railway magnates, would not only rebuild their splendid mansions in the heart of Montreal, but also transport their typically European lifestyle. Bruce McNiven is a descendant of George Drummond, one of the wealthy Scottish shareholders in Canadian Pacific.
Drummond, par exemple, est arrivé ici au Canada comme
Drummond came to Canada as a chemist and was hired as manager of the Redpath refinery. From there, he became involved in finance in other companies, in mining companies. He was also associated with the Bank of Montreal. Near the end of his life, he became president of the Bank of Montreal. But he was also very involved in the economic life of Canada. It was really those Scots, that group of Montrealers, who were the agents of capital here in Canada. That community of Anglophones of Scottish origin in the Square Mile adopted the manners and customs of London. The whole rigid system of balls, of debutantes, of social rules were brought over from London. In fact, we can say that they lived the Victorian life to an even greater degree than the citizens of London.
The most sought-after event in the high society calendar was the debutante ball. When a young girl turned 17, she was ready to come out, to make her debut in society. And there was no ball more prestigious or more traditional than the St. Andrew's Society Ball. This one took place on January 5th, 1878, in the magnificent ballroom of Montreal's Windsor Hotel. It was time for the young debutantes wearing white dresses to make their entrance in society on their father's arms. The gentlemen were dressed in kilts and tartans, following the cherished traditions of the Square Mile elite. A select few young women from the richest families had the chance to meet the most prominent members of the Scottish community. The rules of etiquette in Montreal's Victorian society were very strict. particularly so for the fair sex. For example, young women had to change clothes several times over the course of the day. The garden party was another popular event. This one was held at George Stevens' home in 1908. It was a slightly less formal gathering, but nonetheless a chance to show off one's charm and refinement. The warm winds of the Scottish moors continued to live within the hearts of these men. They had left their homeland, but they'd not forgotten its great traditions. Every fall since 1829, the fox hunt has been held at the Montreal Hunt Club. For these upper-class people, it's less sport than social outing. It's an opportunity for gentlemen to discuss business on horseback. Another opportunity to mix business and pleasure began in the spring at the Royal Montreal Golf Club. Sir George Drummond frequented this club, the first to accept female players as early as 1891.
The lifestyle was European, but adapted to the winter sports and leisure activities of Montreal. So during the winter, for example, they created sports associations and clubs, such as the Montreal Athletic Association, or the Tobogganing Club, or the Snowshoe Club. The first ski jump here was on the mountain near Park Avenue. It was called Fletcher's Field. My great-great-uncle was one of the pioneer skiers in Canada. In 1904, he set a record for ski jumping, which was 76 feet. So you see, the sport was not very advanced at the time.
The descendants of the Scottish elite were honor-bound to respect tradition and preserve the family heritage. Mens sana in corpore sano, a sound mind in a healthy body. Was it not the destiny of these dashing athletes to take up the flame of the family business and pursue brilliant, challenging careers?
We went in for a lot of sports, such as football. Here at McGill, the football club was one of the pioneers in the development of this North American game. In terms of education, the families were very disciplined. It was traditional to send the boys to schools outside of Montreal. In the case of the Drummond family, the boys were sent to England to be educated at Rugby School or Trinity College in Cambridge. Then they returned to Montreal to enter the family business.
Not only were huge fortunes made in the railway industry, but a new way of life came into being. One of the tenets of this new lifestyle was the art of vacationing. Now that there were trains, this distinguished clientele could travel for sheer pleasure or for a change of scenery. At the magnificent Windsor station, the railway barons boarded private railway cars and set off in search of adventure.
Like everyone else, the Drummonds traveled by train. Sir George Drummond would usually rent a railway car. It was possible to rent a private car from Canadian Pacific and attach it to the train and travel that way. So he was in the habit of taking a train. But if he was with a large group or with his family, he would rent a private railway car. He sometimes traveled that way to the United States, and also, I presume, to Rivière-du-Loup, and presumably to the West on occasion. He often traveled to Chicago, which was a major railway center, and also at a certain period to the Laurentians.
But the Scotsman who left his mark in the world of rail more than anyone else in Canada lived far from Montreal, in Ontario. Although Montreal in the 19th century was home to the Canadian aristocracy of Scottish origin, the city could never boast of having among its residents one of the most famous Scots that Canada ever knew. Born in Glasgow, John Alexander MacDonald was 5 years old when his family immigrated to Canada in 1820. He studied law in Kingston, Ontario, then decided to settle there permanently. Here in his parliamentary office, an important page of Canadian history was written. This fine writing desk is one of many gifts that MacDonald received over the course of his lengthy career. The Conservative partisans who gave it to him had it engraved with this most suitable inscription, Dominion Secre Tory, which they jokingly pronounced Secret Tory. 1885 was the year MacDonald fulfilled his dream, the national dream, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railway. That same year, his political friends from Quebec presented him with this solid silver chest. The gift also marked MacDonald's 70th birthday and 40th year of public life. The ornate chest is engraved with his name and decorated with a number of Canadian symbols, from the moose to the beaver. Six years later, in March 1891, John A. MacDonald won his fourth consecutive electoral victory. He died 3 months later at the age of 76. Thousands of Canadians went to the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, where his body lay in state, to pay tribute to the great man. On June 11, 1891, a funeral train took John A. MacDonald to his final resting place in the city of Kingston. The construction of a transcontinental railway was an outrageous, extravagant dream. Few believed it would ever come true, but Sir John A. MacDonald was a true believer of the dream that had such an effect on this country. In Montreal's Dominion Square, in the heart of the business district, stands a majestic bronze statue. It was erected in honor of this famous politician. Montreal had benefited greatly from MacDonald's national policy, and Montreal was the home of the railway barons who had amassed such great fortunes. When World War I began, England needed its money for military purposes, creating difficulties for many private companies. The golden years of the square mile were over.
Many young men from these Montreal families were victims of the First World War. They were killed in action in Europe. So the whole character of the square mile, the whole industrial character of Montreal, in fact, changed at the end of the First World War. And obviously, the lifestyle of the square mile evolved from there too.
It was the end of an era, the era of the railway barons. But the mansions they built left their mark on the urban landscape of Montreal.